Hello and welcome to the public forum of Hydrogen Fuel Cells Europe at the Hannover Messe 2024. It's Friday, we're getting tired. I'm so happy that I still see so many of you here, especially our biggest fan, Brian, right in the middle here. Looking forward to his questions already. And it's Friday, right? We're getting tired. And how nice would it be if you could just send someone else out, right? If you could just send someone else to visit all of these booths, talk to all of these exhibitors, get the actually nice stories out there, sort of do some market analysis, see what the trends are, and you can just sit back, relax, ask that person any question you might have, and you don't need to put in any work because the content is just delivered straight to you. Now, that of course is the concept of the public forum, but this time we're taking it a step further. We took an actual professional. We took a strategy consultant in the hydrogen sector. We sent him all around here. We asked him to moderate some talks here this week. And now he is going to be here answering all of your questions. And don't forget, consultants are expensive, very expensive. I don't know how deep your pockets are, but probably not deep enough to pay him usually. So take this moment because you can ask any question you might have to this man and he will answer it. Now, I think that is the best possible thing that could happen here today. So stay seated and please welcome with me Joris Vlasblom from Hinicio.
Thank you very much, Joost. I love that introduction.
You've deserved it over the week. So, all right, let's see. You are a man with many names. I've already said you're a moderator, you're a consultant. I've known you for a long time, so I have some extra names. I won't share those. Then, just to start off, when you get back to Hinicio, right? You've been here for a full week. After telling them about the party at the Munich Hall yesterday, what is going to be the second story that you will share with your colleagues?
Ooh, that's a good question, Joost. I mean, there are so many amazing stories to tell here. There's so many people doing amazing things, trying to get this hydrogen industry working. But one that really surprised me and that really stuck with me was an interview I had right on stage here with Professor Hinicio from, I believe it was Gaskraft Engineering. And he told me about this new engine that they're developing. So to give you a bit of background, everybody's talking hydrogen, but a very big topic is also ammonia, especially as a fuel for shipping. Of course, it's already used a lot as a feedstock for fertilizer, but I really also see it as a future shipping fuel. And often there's some announcements and there's some things people say, okay, yeah, this is going to happen somewhere far in the future. But Dr. Moore, or Professor Moore, I should say, is already developing the engines now. So last year, I think there were some announcements of ammonia-ready ships, which basically is just a ship with some extra space for potential, engine, let's say, refurbishments later on. But they're actually already developing the engine now. And what I liked about it is the innovative technology that they're using. So for those of you that don't know, ammonia doesn't really like to burn that well. It's very hard to ignite. So what they're doing on that ship is they're cracking part of the ammonia back to hydrogen, because hydrogen, as I think most of you here know, really does like to ignite. So they're using the hydrogen as a pilot fuel in the engine to ignite the ammonia, and therefore they're able to achieve quite a high efficiency, or at least they're planning to achieve quite a high efficiency. Of course, it's still under development. But yeah, that's one of the many innovations that I saw here this week that will stay with me.
All right, I guess your colleagues are definitely looking forward to hearing more about that. For the people just joining us, I'd just like to repeat, during any moment of this talk, you can just wave me down and I'll come find you with the microphone and you can ask a question. Joris, you just shared this story with us of a piece of technology, right? Technology that actually is going to be produced and it's out there. Maybe it's good to sort of set the scene a bit for hydrogen. How does it work? Is it just strives in technology that decide what we're going to see next year? Are there also other factors at play that sort of limit what we can do?
Yeah, so the way we look at it is technology is indeed a very important part of it, but it's very closely, yeah, interconnected, you could say, with regulation and with the markets. So if you want to do anything with hydrogen, you can't just take one of these without considering the others. You really need to take that sort of holistic approach, look at the technology, what's being developed, look at the market, look at what is already in place. Of course, if we could create the entire energy infrastructure today, it would look completely different than how it is now. But of course, we have what we have now. Actually, that reminds me of a talk that I had yesterday with the DVGW, the Deutsche Verband für Gas und Wasser. And there we talked about infrastructure and the key role that infrastructure plays in the hydrogen market. Not just the production, but also, of course, the transportation. We need pipelines to get hydrogen from A to B. Not just what we talked about yesterday, it's not just, let's say, the highways for the hydrogen, like the hydrogen backbone, but we also need it to get to distribute it essentially. So we need a distribution network. And so, yeah, that's one of these market elements that you have to take into account, the current situation. And then the other part is regulation. So hydrogen, I think we're all here to decarbonize. We want to, we want to save the planet, you could say, or we want to reduce climate change. And we can only do that by decarbonizing. And if we didn't have that goal, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be talking about reducing carbon emissions. But we are here to do that. So in order to do that, we need the regulation to enable us to do that. We need the goals. We need the regulators to really drive the market forward. And that's also sort of where you can see that interconnect, because without regulation, there wouldn't be a market for green hydrogen, because it's just, at least for now, it's still too expensive. So yeah, that's where you really can see that interplay.
All right, so we'll call it the triangle of hydrogen with the market on the one side. What do we want? What do the people want? Then we have the technology. What can we actually do? And then the regulation. How can we do it in a safe way? What are we allowed to do? Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. So I guess the technology, you could see it as the laws of physics almost. There's only so much you can do. And the nice things about the laws of physics is no matter how hard you try, you can never break them. And of course, then you have the actual laws and regulation and the market. And they, you have to consider all of these aspects together when you're developing a project or developing even a new technology.
Yeah, and I guess there is a lot of interaction between those three elements then. That is also something we were talking about last year here. We had the same talk on stage. For those of you who missed it, it's still online. It's a great talk to watch. So after this one is done, I would definitely grab your phone and watch that one. Last year, we were talking about the situation in the USA versus the situation here in Europe, regulation-wise, right? And we were talking about green hydrogen especially, how there would be more produced in the US and sort of, there would be a flow towards the EU. For the people here who, regrettably, have not yet seen that talk, could you maybe summarize what we talked about there and how did the situation change since last year?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a topic that I think is on many people's minds, is where should we position ourselves? Where on this globe should we have our projects? And if we look at the regulation in Europe, you can really see a strong, almost top-down approach, saying we have these obligations, we have targets that we need to reach, and we're gonna sort of divide that over the different member states and go from that direction. You can also see that it's really demand focused. So basically it's obligations on industry, on the transport sector to use renewable energy. So it's really sort of a demand pool that will create the market. Well, in the US, the approach is kind of different. It's more of a push, you could say. So with the Inflation Reduction Act that everybody's been talking about, with the 45V, the production tax credit, 45Y is part of it as well a little bit. So the 45Y is on the renewables, on the electricity generation, and the 45V is then on the hydrogen production. But what we can see there is that in the US, they're approaching it a bit differently. And they're sort of trying to push green hydrogen into the market by making it competitive with gray hydrogen or with other sources of energy. So that really creates a push into the market from that side. Of course, if you combine the two, if you have a push from one side and a pull from the other, you can imagine that there's a lot flowing from one to the other. And that's also something that we actually see in the projects that we do. We have a lot of interest from our clients looking to export mostly ammonia from the US to Europe, potentially then to crack it here and to use it as hydrogen in all sorts of applications, or simply for the use of ammonia. However, what we also see is that it's not all sunshines and rainbows in the US. They're sort of, don't want to say coming back on what they're promising, but they're being more strict like in Europe. So in Europe, the requirements for green hydrogen are quite strict, you could say, almost, some say, too restrictive. But still, you need to show that you produce your hydrogen in the same hour, that there's also renewable electricity generation, which makes sense. I mean, we don't want a natural gas turbine to ramp up to supply electricity to an electrolyzer to produce green, well, in that case, not so green hydrogen. But we can also see actually that mindset is now being adopted by the regulators in the US, and they're also setting sort of stricter restrictions on what is allowed under, or to receive the production tax credit in the 45V and the 45Y, to be considered as green hydrogen in that scheme. And I think I'm not sure what's the best approach. I think both approaches can work if they're done correctly. I think both have their pitfalls as well. For instance, in Europe, it's still quite difficult to get a project off the ground just because those regulations are so restrictive, and it brings up the cost because you don't have the operating hours. You have to basically spread your capex and your opex over a smaller amount of hydrogen that you can produce, which brings up the cost. But on the other hand, the approach in US can also have its pitfalls because you're pushing without knowing where the hydrogen will go. So I was at a conference last year where I spoke to a project developer from the US, and they told me, we have this electrolyzer that's going to produce hydrogen. And I believe they had a quite mature project, so they were going to be operational relatively soon. So I wondered, okay, so what's your offtake? Because that's always the question when someone's developing a hydrogen project. What's the offtake? Where's the hydrogen going to go? And then they told me, yeah, it's next to a gas turbine. And I was like, yeah, okay, so where's the hydrogen going to go? Yeah, it's going to go into the turbine. So all they were considering doing is simply producing hydrogen to directly send it into a gas turbine to burn it again and generate electricity. Basically, sort of a hot air machine, you could almost call it. I see some confused faces here in the audience, and I can tell you my face was just as confused when I heard about this.
So just to be clear, they used electricity to produce hydrogen to then immediately turn that hydrogen back into electricity.
Exactly.
With a lot of losses.
So that's why I'm saying it was basically a hot air machine. All they were creating was hot air and money. I mean, that's don't want to say, I don't want to talk too much about American culture, but of course, that's something that that people like to do.
All right. Yeah, I think last year we called it the carrot and the stick, right? So in Europe we have
Exactly.
the sort of the stick method. You shall do this or you shall not do this. Whereas in the US it's like, well, if you do this, maybe you get a bit of this nice little carrot,
Yeah, or you get a piece of candy.
a piece of candy. All right. So some global market dynamics are having an impact on the way the hydrogen industry is developing. We've now discussed the US versus Europe. If I look around here with sort of my global presence goggles on, let's say, Asia is really growing in its presence here. If I look at the number of exhibitors here from Asia compared to earlier years, it's a big step up, even more so. I mean, the whole hall has grown, but the number of Asian exhibitors even more so. What is happening from there?
Yeah, I mean they see the potential. I think that's one of the topics that we talk about. I mean, it's not just the Asian OEMs, it's also the banks, everything. They see potential in hydrogen. They see hydrogen as a future industry, and they want a piece of the cake. So we see a lot of Chinese and Japanese and Asian OEMs entering the market, producing electrolyzers, producing all kinds of hydrogen-related systems. And I'm very curious to see how this will develop. I know some big names also in the hydrogen project development scene. They're really rooting for for Chinese electrolyzers because they believe that it will bring down the cost significantly to the point where basically green hydrogen can be competitive with gray or with other types of hydrogen. But of course, we should also be careful that we're here in Europe. We have all of this IP that we're developing. We have all of this research and development that we're doing into electrolyzers, into fuel cells. And I think we should we should also try to capitalize on that and make sure that some of these manufacturing plants also remain in Europe and that at least we remain, let's say, thought leaders on these topics. And last but not least, of course, safety. We should make sure that we're not moving too fast and like disregarding the point of safety, because in the end, of course, we can make hydrogen very safe, but we need to stay careful because it is still a very energetic molecule that we're working with.
So we want to keep part of that industry, at least part of that industry here in Europe. That reminds me of the situation with PV, of course, right? Solar. A lot of it was developed here in Germany. A lot of the R&D happened right here, and then we lost it to China, basically, right? So you are not a PV expert, so I don't know if you are able to answer this question. But what went wrong there, and how can we make sure that we're not making the same mistake now with hydrogen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like if you look at the way PV has developed, I think it's hard to say that we did something wrong. I mean, if you look at the cost of PV, I think every few years it decreases by a tenfold. So it's hard to say that we did something wrong there, because I mean we're all benefiting from cheap PV. I think right now PV panels are almost as cheap as glass panels. So you could almost use PV panels just as a construction material and have every building generate electricity. But on the other hand, indeed, it perhaps would have been nice if some of that manufacturing would have taken place in Europe. And yeah, of course, it's hard to go back in time and see how to deal with that. One thing that I've heard a lot also from the exhibitors here is we need also support on the manufacturing side here in Europe. So a lot of the public funding is going towards projects, basically, so towards production of hydrogen, so production of the molecule. But there are less schemes developing the factories. So we need the factories to build the electrolyzers. And by supporting those, by making sure that the factories that we build here in Europe can compete with those overseas, I think that's yeah, a win-win, and potentially one of the ways we can yeah, make sure that not all of the industry goes to places like China.
Okay, all policymakers here, take notes, please. Otherwise, we won't be here in a few years. You already mentioned it for the PV case. We are benefiting massively from the low prices. Hydrogen could also do with some lower prices, right? We're all pushing for lower prices, but how low is low enough? When is it good enough? And how can you predict that?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question in hydrogen. How low is low enough? And this is also a topic that we work on quite a lot at Hinicio, is willingness to pay. So as I just told you, sort of the way, especially European legislation is set up, is that there's this compliance market that will essentially create this specific demand, not just for hydrogen as a commodity, but green hydrogen. So hydrogen with the attributes that it has a low carbon footprint, that it comes from renewable electricity. And yeah, by creating this demand, there will be a premium for this green hydrogen. Of course, the million-dollar question is, how big will this premium be? And this is something that yeah, we work on with our clients to understand, okay, what are the obligations that they have? What are the ways that they can fill those obligations? In some cases, it's easier to define that than in others. For instance, now we're diving quite deep in regulation, but please bear with me. It's a bit of a dusty topic, but I think it's very important, because it's in the end what's gonna yeah make the market lift off. But in the RED 3, there's a target for industry, so specifically for industry consuming hydrogen, that by 2030, from the top of my head, 40% needs to be green. So it needs to have that RFMBO stamp. And that means that that's not negotiable. That's an obligation that they have to fulfill.
The stick.
Exactly, that's the stick. And that's relatively easy because it's hydrogen versus hydrogen. But if you look at, for instance, the mobility targets, the transportation, there, hydrogen is not the only option. And there's also battery electric vehicles, there's biofuels, there's all of these other options that hydrogen is competing with in that space. And that makes it an interesting challenge to figure out, yeah, what's the willingness to pay for hydrogen.
Yeah, that brings to mind another topic. Our colleague Brian here had a talk on stage with Skeet Milburn, super interesting. And one of the topics they talked about was the democratization of energy generation, right? How the renewable energy sources are sort of allowing countries that might not have huge reserves of oil to also become a big player in this field. However, if we look at this tendency to go for the lower cost, as you just established, does that still hold? Like, is it actually going to happen, or are we still going to go to the places where the renewable energy can be produced the cheapest?
Yeah, that's of course a tough question. I mean, indeed, there is the potential to have decentralized generation, decentralized production. So, I mean, that's what we see with PV, right? Everybody can have solar panels on their roof and can generate their own electricity. But generating that electricity on your home might be more expensive than in a huge solar farm somewhere in the Sahara. So indeed, there is cost differences there, and there are regions where it's just a lot cheaper to produce. I mean, I think Ski also mentioned Namibia. We also see potential in Chile. Our friends from Norway actually have a very good potential for low-cost hydrogen production. And yeah, it's tough to say whether I mean, what we're seeing now is there is indeed this race to the bottom, especially when we consider going the ammonia route, and you have this globally traded commodity of ammonia that can be easily transported all over the world with actually very little extra cost when it comes to the transportation. So that does leave us in a situation where we might still get dependent on countries like the Namibia, the Chile. Of course, it's a little bit more diversified, you could say, than it is with oil and gas. But there could still be these geopolitical links and these dependencies. Of course, a way to, yeah, or minimize that is through subsidies or through contracts for differences. So this is, I think this is almost more of a political question. Are we okay with being dependent on imports, or do we want to have at least a minimum base load production in Northwest Europe or in Europe in general? And in the end, that will be up to the politicians to decide. But I think that's something that we have to make a conscious decision, because what Ski also mentioned this morning is with natural gas, we fell into this rat race where we wanted to race to the bottom. We wanted to have the cheapest gas, and therefore we had huge dependencies on Russia. And yeah, we all know what happened next. So I think we need to be somewhat careful there and make sure that we also have some production here in Europe, at least as a backup.
Makes sense. I'd like to remind the audience, this is a very expensive consultant, and you are allowed to ask questions for free today. For free, absolutely no cost attached. So make sure to use that opportunity and flag me down if you do have a question. Joris, you just said hydrogen can be produced in other places. You mentioned Namibia. Now, Namibia is quite far from here, right? So how do we get that hydrogen from Namibia to here then? Is there going to be a long pipe? Is there going to be the famous hydrogen backbone? Or is this going to be ships? How is that going to look like, this global market for hydrogen?
Well, it's I'm going to twist your question around a little bit, because I think the question is not where do we get our hydrogen from, because I mean, we're here at a hydrogen fair, but in my opinion, or in my belief, nobody wants hydrogen, because hydrogen is just a means to an end, right? People, they want to get from A to B. They want the energy to do that. They want a fuel to fuel their car or their whatever. They want ammonia to produce fertilizer such that they can produce the crops, produce the food. They want methanol to produce all kinds of other interesting plastics, substances, etc. So it's not really about getting the hydrogen here. It's more about getting that energy from there to here. And on your infrastructure question, do I see a pipeline from Namibia to Europe? Most likely not. I mean, that's quite a long distance that we're covering there, where short distances, I do believe pipelines are crucial infrastructure to connect supply to demand. For instance, our friends from Norway, I see it as crucial to have that connection from Norway to Northwest Europe, such that, for instance, all of the industry in the Ruhrgebiet here in Germany can use the green hydrogen from Norway. All of the industry in the Netherlands can use that cheap green hydrogen. But if we look at the intercontinental trade, I think that's going to be more in molecules that can be easily transported as a liquid, like ammonia. I also see a lot of potential for methanol. Now you might be wondering why methanol, that still has a carbon molecule in it, and carbon is our enemy. But there are sustainable ways to use or recycle carbon and get it into the streams as well. So do I see a pipeline from Namibia to Europe? Most likely not. That I see mostly going through the ammonia route. But for shorter distances, I think pipelines are definitely key infrastructure.
Yeah, and you mentioned that hydrogen backbone that's going to run, or hopefully run, from Norway to Europe. I had another interesting talk with an exhibitor from the H2 Mare project this week. I don't know if you know the project. That is also quite interesting. So they're going to be able to produce hydrogen, right, like on sea, and that also allows us to put bigger wind turbines because it's further out in the sea, and they can directly connect to that backbone. Um, then I also had another talk with an exhibitor about the backbone here in Germany that's going to be decided on actually in the next few weeks already. So in the next few weeks, they will have to make an FID on, are we going to build this backbone or not? And I heard that more often here. Like, it's not about next year, it's not about the next 2 years. It's really about the coming months and sometimes even weeks. How important is this coming year, really the short term for the future of hydrogen? Do you see many of these sort of make it or break it scenarios?
Definitely, I think this year is going to be very important for many hydrogen projects. I believe for the entire industry. Of course, we say that every year, so I'm gonna tell you why I think this year is very important. One thing I see is the market is really maturing. So I was in Rotterdam last, I think it was November, at a hydrogen congress, and I've never seen that many bankers at a hydrogen fair. And you might be wondering, why are you so excited about bankers? I don't like to work with bankers. But the reason I'm excited about bankers is because we can't run this all on public funding. We need the equity. We need basically we need the cash from the financial institutions to get the big projects off the ground. I mean, yes, a pilot scale project, often the companies can do sort of from their own budgets. But if we're talking multiple hundreds of megawatts or gigawatts, you need some debt basically to get those projects off the ground. But that's also why I see this year as critical, because all of the big project developers, the oil and gas players, they've sort of given their business developers free reins for the past years to develop their projects, to sort of scout the market. But I mean, the economy last year took a little bit of or it slowed down a little bit, we can say. We can also see the hydrogen market slowing down a little bit this year. So there's going to be pressure coming from the shareholders, from the top management of all of these big companies onto those project developers. They're going to want to see results pretty soon. And if there's no results, those projects are either going to be put in the fridge or scrapped altogether. So that's how I see this year as being super important. But it's not just negative. It's not, I don't want to be too pessimistic, because I think there's also a lot of interesting things coming up. In our willingness to pay assessment that we talked about earlier, one of the things that we found is that it's not the European regulation that makes or breaks the business case. It's really the way the different member states transpose that into their national law that, creates that tipping point whether a project is profitable or not. So this year we expect the RED 3, so the stuff that I talked about with the industry targets, to be transposed into national law, meaning that when all of that new legislation comes out, that will create that driver for industry to be more renewable, and it will create that obligation that will create that market premium that we're waiting for to get those projects to FID. So I do see a lot of projects being scrapped this year, but I also see a lot of projects potentially taking FID this year.
And for the audience that doesn't know, this RED 3 you mentioned, that is basically the stamp the EU will be able to give to say this is green hydrogen, right? Basically the rules to what can you call green hydrogen and what can you not call green hydrogen. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a bit more complex than that, unfortunately. But the RED is just an abbreviation for Renewable Energy Directive, and that's sort of the big European legislation on everything renewable energy. Part of the Green Deal that you've probably all heard about. I don't want to bore you too much with all of the regulation talk, but indeed the RED is one of the key pieces of legislation that will push the hydrogen market.
All right, so an important year ahead for hydrogen. What probably won't happen in this year, but what might happen in the future. I know you are you studied in aviation, or what do I call it, an aerospace engineer. That's what you are. So flying on hydrogen, is it ever going to happen? Not next year, I think, but when will it and how?
It's a tough question. So there's a lot of things working against you if you want to fly on hydrogen. So first of all, regulation, legislation, homologation,
Gravity.
gravity. No, but here I'm talking about the regulation. So in my degree, what they often said is your airplane will only be certified to fly if the pile of paperwork to regulate it and to certify it is bigger than the airplane itself. And I think that also holds for going for a new fuel. So hydrogen, before we get all of the regulation to have commercial aircraft flying on hydrogen, that's going to take a while. I don't see that happening in the coming years. I see that more as maybe a 2030 or even post 2030. So that's regulation. Of course, we also have the laws of physics that we need to work with. As you all know, hydrogen is very light. It's very energy dense from a gravitational perspective, from a mass perspective, but it takes up a lot of volume because it's a gas. I mean, we can make it a liquid, but it's pretty chilly at minus 250 Celsius. So let's say we use it as a gas. We compress it to 700 bar like we do with road-going mobility. Then still you have huge tanks filled with hydrogen that you need to take on board. And I don't know if you've been in a plane recently, but often the seats are right against your knees. So I find it hard to believe that airlines will be basically giving up some of the fuselage space to put hydrogen tanks in there, to put fuel cells in there, to essentially run on hydrogen. Maybe some short-range aircraft, like potentially you could fly from here to London at some point on hydrogen, but especially on the long-haul flights, it's just impossible. The laws of physics just don't allow it. Another reason for that is what we call in aviation, it's the snowball effect. So for every kilogram that you add to an aircraft, you don't add a kilogram, but you add multiple kilograms, because that kilogram means that you need more lift to keep your aircraft in the air, which means you have bigger wings, which means you have more weight there. Also, you're burning more fuel to get that plane, so you need more fuel to take on board, which means so everything you add, every kilogram you add adds up, like the cartoon snowball that you roll down a mountain. So that's why for long-haul aviation, I really see the future going towards still hydrocarbons. We can't go around that because that's just, it's almost like magic. It's like a magic potion, what we're using now, the kerosene. And we basically, if we want to decarbonize aviation, of course, one of the routes is going for new fuels, but I think potentially an even bigger CO2 saving can be made by taking the fuel that we are already using, but producing that in a sustainable way, either through biofuels or through eSAF.
Yeah, and I'd love to get deeper into that SAF, because I know that's you're passionate about that. But first, we have a question from the audience. Could you please introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Casper. Come from Denmark. Work for a company called Agilic. And I just wanted to ask, a lot of these things can seem kind of abstract, and there are a lot of dependencies that you're always waiting for. So it's very difficult to see into the future. But what is a milestone that you see the hydrogen space achieving within the next few years that you personally are most excited for?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of things that I'm excited for. What I was saying is taking FID for big projects. So what a lot of the people here have been talking about is, okay, we have done all of this R&D, we have all of this great technology, but we need to get it out to the customers. We need to, yeah, to get it into the hands. And that I'm not just talking about fuel cell vehicles, but I'm really talking about the hydrogen for the industrial uses, because I think that's the first milestone where we can have huge CO2 savings. Hydrogen is not something new. We've been using metric tons of hydrogen for years now in ammonia production for fertilizers, in refineries, in all kinds of production processes. So what I'm really looking forward to is some of these big projects actually being realized. I mean, we saw a good example in the Netherlands. I believe it's a 200 megawatt electrolyzer, Holland Hydrogen 1, in the port of Rotterdam, that they took FID somewhere in the past years, and now they're starting construction. And I want to see more of that. I want to see see it actually happening rather than just pieces of paper. And I mean, there are plenty other things that I'm excited for, but this is, I think what we really need at the moment.
All right, any other questions, perhaps? No? I do have another question. I had a talk here last week with last year, with an exhibitor, and he told a story of how he got two cars, and bear with me. Basically, we had horses, right? We used to have horses with carts, and it was fine. You know, you gave them some carrots, quite nice. You could grow them yourself if you want. You don't need to go to the gas station, whatever. However, these horses, you know, they produce manure, shit, basically, right? So the whole street was filled with horse shit, and that was not so nice. So that's why it was such a revelation to everyone when the car was there. Oh, look at this. We don't have any shit on the street anymore, right? Now, 100 years later, we figured out, okay, we still, you know, cars also produce shit. It's just not on the street. It's in the air, right? So we had this silver bullet, magical solution. We take cars, gone are the horses, and all the problems are gone. Now we look at hydrogen, right? And that is the next sort of evolution. If I look at mobility specific then, right? The next silver bullet. Does hydrogen also have shit? Like what is the thing we're going to regret 50 years from now about making this shift?
Well, I think that brings me back to the point that I said earlier. Nobody wants hydrogen. Nobody wants petrol-powered cars. People want to get from A to B. So I think what we should be careful about is that we don't do hydrogen just for the sake of doing hydrogen, just because there's this hype or there's this, it's cool and it's fashionable. But we should always be careful that we think, is hydrogen really the best solution for this, or are there better ways to do this? So yeah, what's hydrogen's shit? It's tough to say. I mean, of course, if maybe 10 years or 20 years or 50 years from now, we'll realize that there is some shit related to it. I think what we can already say is water usage is something that we should be careful about, especially because a lot of the regions where you can potentially produce very cheap hydrogen also have shortages of water, right? We are talking about deserts. We talked about Namibia. I don't think Namibia has a surplus of fresh water to use. But what I also see is that potentially hydrogen can be an enabler to those regions and to those communities to create fresh water. So desalination at a large scale scaling that up a little bit such that the local communities also have potable drinking water, I think, yeah, that would be a very nice way to work with that. But I guess for the rest, we'll see what if hydrogen has some downsides to it as well.
We're going to be experiencing it together. We've talked about this, the triangle of hydrogen a few times now, right? So it was the market, the regulations, and the technology. If I look around here, maybe in the public forum, the regulations are there sometimes, but most of what I'm seeing here is the technology side, and we are the market. Focusing on the technology side, you've walked around here all week. What are some of the projects that are really exciting and new and fresh, and the people need to hear about them?
So I already talked about Professor Meur and his ammonia engine. So that's one thing that I'm really excited about. Another one is another professor, actually. I can't remember his name, but he presented on Wednesday on the technical forum. One of the topics in especially PEM fuel cells is the availability of rare earth metals like platinum and iridium. And what he was presenting at the technical forum is that they can reduce the iridium loading on the membranes by about a tenfold with some new innovations. And I think innovations like that are key to, one, make sure that we actually have enough rare earth metals available, and two, to get the cost down, because these are, I believe, some of the numbers I've heard is around 60% of the fuel cell cost comes from those rare earth metals. So if we can reduce how much we need, then we can also bring down the cost quite significantly. And maybe this point of rare earth metals could be the shit of hydrogen. It could be the mining of those. I mean, we see this with batteries as well, right? If you look at Latin America and the lithium mining industry that has just popped up there with the batteries, and the somewhat questionable environmental concerns that are sometimes, or practices that are sometimes taking place there. We have to make sure that these upstream processes that are required to get all of the equipment that we use in this hydrogen industry also come from renewable or sustainable practices. To that point, another interesting talk I had this week was with Siemens. They developed what they call Sea Green, which is like a passport for their technology. So it's essentially tracking all of the upstream processes, the energy usage, the carbon footprint, everything that comes with their product. They track it and they can put a passport with it. And I really like these kinds of developments because it sort of holds the industry accountable for what they're actually doing. And just as we heard from the talk this morning with Brian and Dr. Milborn, is that upstream emissions are often overlooked, but they're super important to take into account in everything. Otherwise, you're being super green on one end, but you're polluting elsewhere. And in the end, we're all sharing the same atmosphere, so we need to make sure that it stays sustainable everywhere.
So now Siemens is developing this passport, which is great, right? Because we need to look at this entire value chain. But isn't that something that policymakers should do?
Yeah, so that is already happening for hydrogen. So for the molecule itself, certification is very important. A few years ago, Hinicio was also very active in this. We developed Certify, which is basically a certification scheme for green hydrogen, where we track all of the attributes, you track the carbon footprint, and now with legislation from the European Union, you have the delegated acts that are connected to the RED III. Sorry again to bore you with all of this regulatory talk, but it's in the end what's going to drive the industry. So these standards are being set, and it is being made sure that all of the green hydrogen that we use is actually green and not green with a grayish tint to it.
I always love the names in the hydrogen industry. The Certify. There's always a lot of jokes in there. Joris, we are sort of closing in on the end of our talk here. I don't know if there are any remaining questions from the audience. And if not, if you have any closing remarks, anything you would like the audience to know before we say goodbye to you here.
Well, I'm really happy to be here. That's what I want to start with. It's really inspiring to be here, to see all of the companies developing the technology, bringing the industry forward. As I said, we have this trilogy of technology, market, and regulation. So let's hope that the regulators do their part. I'm pretty sure all of the technology providers are doing their part. And we are happy to help you figure out the market.
All right. You don't have a booth here with the company. However, I do know he has a big stack of business cards, and he's going to be right there waiting for you to hand them out. He is a consultant after all, so I'm sure that's going to go all right. Joris, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your talk and all your insights. Please, a warm applause for our Joris.
Thank you very much for having me, Joost.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you all.